5, working with the book Divine Audacity by Reverend Linda Martello Whitsitt. It's a contemporary take on a Unity concept called the 12 Powers. It was developed by Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore. And I said a couple of weeks ago that the 12 Powers is Charles Fillmore's concept or idea of the good, as in the true, the good, and the beautiful. Now, if we were in a philosophy class here right now, we would be calling the 12 Powers a system of virtue ethics, identifying the key virtues, trying to identify the key virtues that we need to practice in order to have a good life. So the true, the good, and the beautiful, those were the virtues that were identified by Plato that he thought we needed to practice in order to have a good life. And there are some folks in Unity who think that Unity is based in large part on the philosophy of Plato. Also, another ancient Greek group, the Stoics, they had their own set of core virtues, which are courage, wisdom, justice, wisdom, courage, and moderation. And then they take those and they further subdivide them so that eventually you get something like 18 different virtues. So they've created a little more complex of a system than we have here in Unity. The Buddhists, a whole different culture, they have their own system of virtue ethics, their own version of the 12 Powers, really. But they call them the paramitas, or the perfections, and there's only 10. Generosity, morality, renunciation, wisdom, diligence, patience, honesty, determination, loving kindness, often referred to as compassion, and equanimity. So we see this in different cultures and across different time spans where these different groups have come together to try to identify the kind of things we need to practice and focus on in order to be good people. That's what Charles was trying to do with the 12 Powers. We see similarities, right? And we see some big differences, but the one thing they all have in common is that they want to identify the kind of things that we need in order to be able to thrive and to create a world that really works for all, not just the elite and the privileged. These are supposed to be virtues that everyone is able to embrace and practice. So the powers we're looking at today are zeal and power, the power of power. That sounds redundant, but it's not really, as we'll see. Let's start with zeal, though. Zeal is identified as great energy or enthusiasm in pursuit of a cause or objective. Now, when you think of things that people in this country pursue with great energy or enthusiasm, well, there are a few things in this country that are pursued with greater energy and enthusiasm than professional sports. Yeah. Am I right? Yeah. There were some very energetic and enthusiastic Cub fans Thursday morning after the Cubs finally won the World Series. And it just goes to show you that prayer works. Give or take 116 years. I'll tell you. They say God works in mysterious ways, sometimes downright cruel, but there it is. What do you call a person who follows a team and wears the clothes and wears the hats and never misses a game and talks about it all the time? What do you call that? That's a sports fan, right? Well, that's actually short for fanatic, right? Yes, and it's a good thing because the short version of the word, being a fan, is great. Fanaticism, not so much. Fanaticism is a word we use for zeal that gets carried to an extreme. So being a fan is great. Let's not push it to the point where we become fanatical. A sports fan is great, right? But nobody likes a religious or a political fanatic. Yeah. Nobody likes a religious fanatic. Zeal needs to be tempered by wisdom and understanding and many other of our powers that need to be balanced out lest we get carried away. Jesus had a disciple named Simon who was called the Zealot. Now, we know absolutely nothing about Simon other than what we can gather from his name. In the days of Jesus, a zealot was a member of a political party called the Zealots. They were determined to protect Jewish religion from the imposition of Roman rituals and to end Roman and Gentile rule over the Jewish people. And they would go to whatever means they thought necessary. The Zealots were revolutionaries. They were political revolutionaries. They were military revolutionaries. They were known for taking up arms against Rome, which was really a dumb thing to do. It was an exercise in futility back in those days, but they were zealous, right? So in the year 66, the Zealots took control of a Roman garrison at a fortress on a mountain plateau known as Masada. You might have heard of Masada. Well, they took over the garrison, and the Romans said, big deal, right? All they did was they surrounded the bottom of this mountainous plateau, and they laid siege to it. They were trapped up there for years. They laid siege for years. You probably heard what happened in the end. The story does not end well. 960 people, the rebels, the Zealots, and their families, women and children, committed suicide rather than be captured by the Romans. It's a sad story, a cautionary tale of what can happen when you get carried away by zeal. Now, granted, that's very extreme, and that is one extreme, overdeveloped zeal. But what happens when we have underdeveloped zeal? Without zeal, well, nothing gets done. Not because of lack of willpower, but because we have no passion. We have no enthusiasm for what we're doing. Just going through the motions, as they say. The opposite of zeal is apathy. Apathy. And they call apathy the element of indifference. The element of indifference. If you look on the periodic table of the elements, this is the element of indifference, and the symbol is meh, right? The element of indifference. Rollo May said that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's apathy, and this guy, Albert Einstein, observed that the world would not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. So, a system of virtue ethics, as common as they are in the world, they're useless unless there's some kind of zeal or enthusiasm behind it, driving it forward to accomplish positive and practical things in the world. Without zeal, that's not going to happen. When Charles Fillmore was 94 years old, he got up one day and he wrote this affirmation. He said, "I fairly sizzle with zeal and enthusiasm and spring forth with a mighty faith to do the things that ought to be done by me." This next one here is a picture of Charles from around that time. Now, do you notice he's standing a little lopsided, right? You can see that very clearly in this picture. He had a hip injury when he was a boy. Ended up with one leg being significantly shorter than the other. He had to wear a lift in his shoe, and sometimes he wore a leg brace, although by the end of his life he didn't need the leg brace anymore. And it also caused him chronic pain throughout his life. By the end of his life, he believed that it was finally healing, that his leg had actually maybe grown some, but it never quite got back to normal. Now, those of you who experience chronic pain know that it's difficult to be enthusiastic about life when you're in pain. And yet, right up until, 3 months before he died, Charles was still traveling. He was going to Florida and California, speaking at all the Unity Centers there. He believed in what he was doing. He had that zeal and enthusiasm. He believed in it with everything he had, and that's what sustained him despite these obvious physical problems that we can see and that we know that he had. So I got to thinking, how often do we sizzle with zeal and enthusiasm? I mean, wouldn't it be neat if there was some kind of a Zeal meter we could run by.
Or a Zeal pill.
See? Right here it's got this needle on it. You may think this is a battery tester. This is a Zeal meter, right? Just imagine you stick your finger in it, and the needle tells you where you're, oh, it's not moving, that's a problem. But, it tells you where you're at. Put your finger in and wake up in the morning, get the Zeal meter out, and if the needle doesn't move, stay in bed, right? Sometimes that's what has to happen. You stay in bed. That's the way it is sometimes. We don't get up every day pinning that needle over on the other side. We don't get up every day feeling like we're on fire about life. Let's be honest, all right? That happens sometimes. There are days when sometimes the best we can do is just show up. That means we have to work through whatever it is we have to work through so we can get fired up again. And not everyone, I don't think everyone is born to sizzle. Some people do just fine at a simmer. Right? Right? They do great things. They have enough zeal and enthusiasm. They're simmering, and they're doing just great. Not everybody has to sizzle as long as you don't fizzle, right? So what do we do? What do we do when we get up and we stick our finger in the Zeal meter and it's pegged at 0, right? What do we do? What do we do when it's hard to feel enthusiastic about much of anything? Well, we try to be practical in Unity, and that means that we take theory and we put it into practice. Norman Vincent Peale said this. He said, one way to become enthusiastic is to look for the plus sign. To make progress in any difficult situation, you have to start with what's right about it and build on that. Very practical, very common sense. Very wise. On one of those days when the meter is at 0, when we wake up and the meter's on 0, what's the first plus sign we can find?
Our eyes open.
We woke up, yeah. We woke up. The old saying, any day above ground is a good day. If our eyes open and we wake up, that's something to start with. That's the first plus sign. So, yeah, things can go wrong, and sometimes it seems like everything goes wrong. But there's at least one thing that's right, and as long as we're living and breathing, and especially thinking, that's a start, and then we can move the needle from there. Okay, we still have to talk about power today. Charles Fillmore defined power as dominion or mastery. Dominion or mastery. He said that the mind and the body of man have the power of transforming energy from one plane of consciousness to another. This is the power and dominion implanted in man from the beginning. The power faculty plays an important part in controlling the expression of the many emotions, inspirations, and thoughts. It's our power of expression as well as our power of self-control. That's what he's getting at here. It's our ability to take our thoughts and ideas from one realm of consciousness, from the abstract, and to put them out into the tangible world in such a way that they can accomplish something, where our thoughts and our ideas can be made real or realized. Someone is called a good leader because they have the ability, the power, to communicate their ideas in such a way that they are clear and easy to understand and compelling without being demanding. Compelling in the sense that people hear it, they know what needs to be done, and they're motivated to do it. You're not a good leader just because you order people around and tell them what to do. That's what a dictator does. The kind of power we're talking about here, healthy, well-developed power, is an inside job. It's the way we manage consciousness. It's the place where we experience and manage our emotions, inspirations, and thoughts. And as we all know, our consciousness training tools in Unity are prayer and meditation. Those are the big ones. Those are the tools that we use to observe and then to be able to manage, to have mastery and dominion at the level of consciousness, in order to make sure that what we communicate to the world is the product of our highest and best self and not the selfish and fearful part of us. And as I said, it's an inside job, so if power is underdeveloped, well, we tend to be unclear. We can be scattered. Our communication can be easily influenced by those emotions and thoughts that we've decided not to be aware of and that we're not able to take control of because we're not paying attention. Our communication can be influenced by whatever emotions and thoughts are bubbling beneath the surface that we're not seeing and dealing with, and that can cause a lot of problems. We can become inconsistent. We may even come across as being devious or insincere. The technical term for it is mealy-mouthed, right? That can happen. That's not power. On the other hand, when power is overdeveloped, when it's taken to an extreme, well, that's when power stops being an inside job because we've bought into the, let's call it the commercial definition of power. Our culture equates power with money, celebrity, and possessions. It's the kind of power that ceases to be an inside job and that we try to project outward in order to control people and events. So instead of dominion and mastery over our own thoughts and emotions, we come across as domineering, authoritarian, and literally as trying to subjugate and control people and circumstances. This is where that famous quote by Lord Acton is spot on. He said, "Oh, the system is paused. I have no power over it." All right. Well, it'll come up when it comes up. There it is. Just in time. The quote is, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Now, we've all heard that before. Everybody knows that quote. This is talking about the kind of power that's directed outward. It's the overdeveloped, dysfunctional version of power. But there's one more line to this quote that is almost always left out. I don't know if you've ever heard of this final line to it. This is part of the quote, actually. It's this one. "Great men are almost always bad men." Isn't that interesting? Maybe a tad cynical, but you know, when I found that whole quote, the place where I found it cited a laboratory study that they did on this whole idea that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and great men are almost always bad men. It was a study that was published in an academic journal, and it was just put out last year, 2015, in a journal called The Leadership Quarterly. So I'm going to put the whole citation up here to the journal article, okay? And I want to call your attention to the part that I've underlined, okay? Leader corruption depends on power and testosterone. That's what they determined in this study. Something to think about. One more point about power. I mentioned at the very start of this series that at one time each of the 12 powers was linked to a physical place in the body. Charles Fillmore did that. But as we've learned more about biology, anatomy, and physiology, we don't link the powers to parts of the body anymore. And there are additional reasons, the reasons in addition to anatomy and physiology, what we know about anatomy and physiology that suggests that we ought not link them to parts of the body anymore. If you read the original book, it was called The 12 Powers of Man. First of all, Charles was definitely not gender neutral, and that's the way it was back then. But he also spends a lot of time, when it comes to power, he spends a lot of time in that chapter talking about how power is located in the throat, in the voice box specifically, that power is linked to the voice and the spoken word. He goes on talking about how if you're faculty of power is well developed, you will have a musical voice, and the singers have great power, and somebody who is weak in the faculty of power will have a tremulous and a weak voice, and so on and so forth. He apparently gave no thought at all to how that would work for someone who had lost the ability to use their voice. Think about that for a minute. That kind of lack of inclusivity, again, that was common back in those days. That was nothing unusual. That was common. You know, we talked about this in one of our discussion groups after the service a couple of weeks ago. Someone mentioned the name Stephen Hawking. Think about that for a moment. He has ALS. He has no voice. All right? But think, I mean, he's gradually lost his voice. He has to communicate through a machine. Think about how he had to master his thoughts and how beautifully he's mastered his thoughts to be able to communicate these amazing concepts of theoretical physics. Don't need a voice to do that. Think about how he has had to master his emotions to deal with an illness that everyone said should have killed him a long time ago, but he's still going strong. It's pretty amazing. Even without a voice, he demonstrates that degree of power. He's able to communicate powerfully, and he has practical ideas about the universe that continue to draw people's attention. So we don't link the powers to physical places in the body. At least I don't anymore. I think with our power of understanding, with what we know today, we know better than to do that, and we can be more inclusive and better able to accommodate the great and beautiful physical diversity of the human family. I think that's so important going forward. So that's all I have today on zeal and power. Next week, strength and order. And you might well be wondering at this point, what is the difference between power and strength? You'll have to come back next week. Oh, and by the way, the color is green. I mean blue.